Hello friends, welcome to our channel Lit Horizon. Today we can go through the work Apology for Poetry written by Philip Sidney in 1595. Are you familiar with the writer Philip Sidney? Philip Sidney is first literary critic of England. He is an Elizabethan writer and his work Astrophel and Stella is considered as the first Elizabethan sonnet, and Arcadia is the first heroic prose romance. Next, we can go through the background of the essay Apology for Poetry. The essay Apology for Poetry is written as a reaction against Stephen GOSSON'S work School of Abuse, because Gosson in School of Abuse criticized English poetry and dedicated this work to Sidney. As a result of this, Philip Sidney wrote Apology for Poetry. The essay falls into 7 divisions. They are exordium, narration, propositio, confirmation, refutation, digression, and perorative. Exordium is the introductory part of the essay. In the narrative part, the author includes a statement of facts. Propositio is a part which includes the thesis of argument. And in confirmation, the author gives the evidences that support the thesis. In the part refutation, author gives answers to the GOSSON'S argument. In the part digression, Sidney deals with poetry of his own time and how it is accepted by contemporary society. The perorative is the conclusion of the essay. Sidney begins the essay by referring to the art of horsemanship and how this profession is to be respected. And he also mentioned the name of his friend Pietro Hugliano. He is an horseman. One may think, why Sidney mentioned horsemanship in this essay, which is about poetry? Am I right? He mentions horsemanship to show that poetry should be treated better than horsemanship. The name Pietro Hugliano is important because it is asked for our university exam. Sidney goes on to classify different kinds of poetry. They are sacred poetry, philosophical or didactic poetry, and right kind of poetry. Sidney values the right kind of poetry because, according to him, the right kind of poetry actually teach and delight the readers. Based on style, structure, and theme, Sidney categorized the right kind of poetry into epic poems, pastoral poems, elegy, iambic, satire, comedy, tragedy, and lyric. This essay mainly deals with two important ideas, that is, poetry is of divine origin and poetry helps in social unity. First of all, we can go through how poetry is of divine origin. In the first section, the Sidney praises poetry. Sidney says the poetry is the cradle of civilization because poetry flourished before any other art or science. For example, the earliest philosophers and historians are poets. Next, Sidney says that the poetry is the channel of divine powers. For praising God, Solomon uses verses in Bible. Next, Sidney says the poetry can teach and delight. Poetry inspires every individual to discard vices of the villains and imitate the noble and virtuous action of the heroes. Next, Sidney says the poetry can surpass the virtue, history, and philosophy because poetry is free to alter, but history and philosophy cannot be altered. Next, we can go through the Stephen GOSSON'S argument against poetry. Stephen GOSSON says that poetry is unprofitable and there are many other better ways to spend our time. But according to Sidney, there is no other branches of learning more fruitful than poetry. Poetry has the power to teach and please. It moves the readers to virtuous actions. So, for Sidney, poetry is far better and effective than history and philosophy. Then Stephen GOSSON says the poetry is mother of lies. As a response to this, Sidney says the poets never lie. They never claim that their poems are truth. In poetry, lies are not deliberately stated. It is for an artistic purposes. So, poet cannot be accused for making lies. Stephen goes and says the poetry leads us to sinful behavior. As a response to this, Sidney says it is abuse of poetry, not poetry, that leads to sin. Stephen Gosson again argues that the Plato kicked the poet from Republic because he hated poetry. But Sidney disagrees with this statement because according to Sidney, Plato had banished only ludicrous poet, not poetry, because Plato drew much genius, knowledge from poetry and was highly poetical in his writing. Sidney concludes the essay by cursing the poet haters that they will never gain the love of their partners and they may be forgotten and their memory will die from the earth. To memorize them, there will be a need of epitaph. Thank you for watching our channel. Please like and subscribe our channel.